Chris Hipkins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Education. Why has funding for the Early Intervention Service declined since 2010 when the Ministry has reported that demand for the service is rising and its ability to respond to referrals on time is declining?
The Honourable Hipkins.
Mr Speaker, I'm advised that funding for the Early Intervention Service has not declined since 2010. What the member will be referring to is a reduction in expenditure in the Early Intervention Service arising from the centralisation of support functions at a regional level between 2010 and 2011. Ensuring greater efficiency in the support functions of the Ministry has enabled them to provide services to a greater number of children. The demand for the Early Intervention Service has increased significantly. This year, the service assisted an additional 2,818 children with early intervention services than our target for 2014-15. This is in part due to the success of the government's focus on more children participating in quality early childhood education.
Supplementary question, Chris Hipkins.
Why did she indicate in answer to written parliamentary question 13282 of this year that funding for the Early Intervention Service had decreased from $41 million in 2010-11 to $40 million in 2014-15?
The Honourable Hipkins.
Mr Speaker, I don't have to hand the specific written parliamentary question. The distinction I'm drawing to the member and the House's attention is between expenditure and funding. So while the amount went down by $2 million, this funding into the service didn't change. Secretarial shared support services became shared across the Ministry, and that explains the difference between those two numbers.
Supplementary question, Chris Hipkins.
How many eligible children did not receive an early intervention service within 90 days of referral last year?
The Honourable Hipkins.
Mr Speaker, I don't have that operational detail to hand. But certainly I can get that for the member. What I can tell you is 11,500 was the target for our service, and we exceeded that by 2,818.
Question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, Chris Hipkins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. How many children were on a waiting list for early intervention service over the last year for more than 6 months?
The Honourable Hipkins.
Mr Speaker, again, I cannot provide that level of operational detail. What I can repeat is that 11,500 were targeted for services. We exceeded that by 2,818.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
A point of order, Chris Hipkins.
Mr Speaker, I seek some guidance from you as to what recourse a member can have when they put down a relatively specific primary question indicating the direction of supplementary questions and ask very specific supplementary questions that they don't get answers to.
Well, the recourse is to try again another day, I guess, or use more supplementaries now, or to put down specifically it in form as written questions. They're the three options. My duty here is to judge whether the question's been addressed, and when a minister says I don't have that information at hand, then the question's been addressed. I think the member actually knows that point.
But further point of order, Mr Speaker.
Further point of order, Chris Hipkins.
Mr Speaker, in cases where ministers haven't prepared that information and don't have that information to hand, will members, we only have a limited number of supplementary questions each day, will members get additional supplementary questions if ministers don't prepare and don't answer their questions?
No, I don't need assistance. The answer to your question is probably no. Supplementary question, Chris Hipkins.
Mr Speaker, did the Ministry of Education fail to provide early intervention support for over 6,000 children within the 90 days required in 2014, and does she think that this is acceptable?
The Honourable Hipkins.
Mr Speaker, I cannot speak to that specific detail, but what I can tell you is that it's not acceptable, and that is why we have been undertaking a special education review up and down the country this year. We have met with extraordinary numbers of parents and providers to understand what the challenges are so that we can improve the support. We do that, however, in the context of this government having raised the funding into special education by 26%. It's now stands at $530 million.
Point of order, Chris Hipkins.
Mr Speaker, I seek some further guidance from you as to what opposition members can do when a minister says that they can't answer a question and then goes on to provide a short speech on a whole range of other issues.
Order. The member's now starting to trifle with me on this matter. I have said on many occasions in the House, I will judge the length of answers. Often I think it's been answered very quickly and the additional information is simply superfluous. Sometimes I judge that the information may be of value to members. Supplementary question, Catherine Delahunty.
What is her response to the 89% of early childhood council centres surveyed in October this year who said they had not received education support workers services for children with dyslexia, dyspraxia and autism for the amount of time that they required them?
The Honourable Heke Parata.
Well, Mr Speaker, first of all, it was 80%, which amounted to 100 services out of 5,230. And my answer is the same as to the previous question. We are concerned about some of the difficulties being experienced in the special education system, and that is why we are reviewing it, and I welcome the Select Committee report that the member is referencing.
Supplementary question, Catherine Delahunty.
Will she commit more funding for early intervention services so that the delayed development of children with learning differences doesn't create more costs for the education, health and justice system and children are not struggling under the label of failure?
The Honourable Heke Parata.
Mr Speaker, we are finding in the review that too much of the provision for special education is siloed into specific programs. So the early intervention program is one of a range of support services that are provided to early childhood, for early childhood provision, and we're looking at how we can relax the boundaries between those services so that we can help more kids without tripping over these program parameters.
Point of order, Catherine Delahunty.
Thank you, Minister. It was very helpful, but I just did ask, would the Minister commit more funding?
Yeah, I wish the question had been as simple as that. Why don't we allow you on this occasion to ask an additional supplementary, make it as simple as that, and then we can assist with an answer. Catherine Delahunty, an additional supplementary question.
Will the Minister commit more funding given the increasing numbers of children who need...
No, this is where we get into trouble. I'm trying to help the member. If the member just rises and asks whether there will be increased funding, but when she starts to add more and more, it gives the minister every avenue to answer the other parts of the question. I'm trying to help the member. I'm giving her extra assistance here, being very generous on a Thursday. It's effectively an extra sup. I invite her to ask it. Supplementary question, Catherine Delahunty.
Will the Minister commit more funding?
The Honourable to
early intervention services so that our kids get their needs met.
Order, that's all we need. The Honourable Heke Parata.
Mr Speaker, there is already more funding available to that group of children. They're just not all called early intervention services. There's an early hearing service. There are services for speech therapy. There are services for different disabilities. And all of those, we are trying to bring them together into a wraparound service rather than siloing them into one program. I'm not ashamed, actually.
Order. The question now has been addressed. Question number 5, Simon O'Connor.
Thank you, Mr.